Yes, I'm going to present some work that's part of an ongoing research project, an interdisciplinary project with a very large team as part of the CRC for water sensitive cities. And it's work across three states and 3 cities, primarily in Melbourne, Perth and Brisbane, but I'm going to talk mainly about the Melbourne work today. I'd like to also just acknowledge, as well as the broader research team, that there are a lot of students from Monash Architecture who've contributed to this research over the last few years, and some of their work will be shown today. I also just want to say at the beginning that as an architect, I'm pretty aware that I'm speaking a bit outside of my discipline today, and to a bunch of landscape architects and people who may know a lot more than this about all these things. However, it's done in the spirit that as urbanists and designers in the physical realm, we just felt that there's such a lot of extra information that we need to know. And so this was part of our way of trying to find some things out. So if we take a 3-dimensional and longitudinal view rather than the simple 2-dimensional space of the political map, then issues of coastline, territory and sea level become quickly more interesting. As is well known, large sections of the presently dry Australian continent were at various times underwater, and areas that are currently shallow seas and bays were previously dry land. For example, within the time span of Indigenous occupation is memory of Port Phillip Bay as an open meadow and hunting ground, and stories exist of the calamity and disruption of its inundation approximately 10,000 years ago as global sea levels rose. Landscape architect Craig Burton and others have described the continent as being made up of blocks and basins, which has been useful for us as a construct with which to think of the landscape through water. Ancient rocks in WA, some are estimated at 4 billion years old, which are continually being eroded and their sediment accumulating in the alluvial soils and floodplains of the sedimentary basins between them. That's both surface basins and subsurface basins or aquifers. Many of these basins overlap with and continue beneath our current coastline. Most of our cities lie within this fertile alluvial and sedimentary zone at the intersection of freshwater and sea. Considering the geomorphological conditions can influence our conception of the city, its terrain and natural extent. Large parts of Melbourne lie within a physiographic region known as the Victorian Southern Lowlands, which collects sediment and runoff from the Great Dividing Range, whose natural pre-colonial state contained large areas of spongy, waterlogged land, most of which has now been drained for agriculture and urban settlement. Within this broad lowland region is a localised sunkland, which stretches from Rowsley Fault in Bacchus Marsh to Heath Hill Fault in Druin. Melbourne CBD is located at a geological junction point within this terrain, a hinge between 4 different types of ground, leading to asymmetrical conditions, land uses, vegetation, climate, and development patterns around the core over time. And here we see the 1950 urban footprint against this 2000, the current footprint, and who knows, potential future footprint. The flatness of this sunkland means that small fluctuations in sea level and rainfall flood level can have large territorial effects. The edge between land and water once contained numerous variants of saltwater and freshwater ponds, marshes, and intermittently open and closed lagoons. These previous wetlands, marshes and grasslands have been the subject of radical and comprehensive modifications over the 19th and 20th centuries. Large-scale drainage, land filling, river diversions, undergrounding of creeks, dredging and reclamation works, all completely typical actions for low-lying coastal cities worldwide. But perhaps all the more pertinent here, as Andrew mentioned before, due to the central significance of wetlands and swamps to Indigenous culture for social gatherings and food supply, and the absolute contrast of this abundance with the way such lands were viewed by Western colonisers. Cumulative actions of urbanisation and engineering have masked the underlying natural water structure of our coastal places, but now through increasing pressures of urbanised and hardening catchments and climate intensity, that deep structure reasserts itself at increasingly frequent intervals. Here's just an example, sorry, I just got out of sequence there, of one of the largest swamps that was on the Western Port Bay, the so-called Great Swamp near Kubi Rup, that was a highly complex and multicellular wetland system that was drained first in the late 19th century, and then again when that didn't quite work in the 1920s and 30s. And that was seen as it was linked with the infrastructure of the railways connecting Melbourne to Gippsland. And that passage across land was not possible before the swamp was drained. These are the channels just a few years ago, and you can see the mangroves are now finding their way further inland as the salinity levels change in the landscape. Here's the flood after the first draining in the town of Kubi Rup. And in the town of Elwood, suburb of Elwood, which I'll speak about. This is a flood in 2016, just 5 years after the last so-called 100-year flood in 2011. Our research has focused on the intersection of Melbourne with the broader lowlands condition, in particular locations which are both prone to fluvial flooding and vulnerable to sea level rise and storm surge. I'm going to briefly discuss two case studies. First, an established community in the suburb of Elwood, and secondly, a new development zone in Arden Macaulay, a series of urban strategies working from small scale and immediate to longer term visions. So the suburb of Elwood is here, and the catchment that feeds it is the Elster Creek catchment here along these low sandy ridges of southeast Melbourne. Elwood was one of the many swampy lagoons around the coast of Port Phillip Bay that was then drained by the Elwood Canal. And as was mentioned earlier, this project started with a series of community visioning workshops led by the social science team within the CRC, and also included flood modellers analysing the performance of the catchment. And as was well known to the community, one of the problems is that the catchment is across 4 municipalities, and the people who feel the impacts of the catchment in the city of Port Phillip had no mechanism to speak to the other councils who were affecting them. And so the project involved a very important output was a new forum where the 4 councils agreed to share information and share their plans. Here we started by mapping available public space in the form of parks and schools across the 4 councils that could be thought of as a cumulative network of increasing water storage capacity over time. And to give the 4 councils a plan that every small action they did might be joined together and thought of as adding towards a bigger vision. And this was probably the first thing that the community raised at the very first community workshops. And so we tested a number of design scenarios with the modelling team, and that included trying to re-separate the freshwater and saltwater systems with a series of spillways and gates and allow more storage capacity in the foreshore, and introduction of mangroves and other environments that might act as shock absorbers for storm surge. And also increasing capacity within the lower parts of the catchment as the first stages, and also, as was mentioned before, as an educational project. So here we have the Elwood Canal, which is the drain of the swamp, passing through a critical point where there's a public park, a high school and a primary school. And these were talked about with the community as almost being custodians of the canal. The schools and the students coming through the schools could have a conscious raised awareness that could influence their educational programs, as well as widening the storage capacity along the canal by modifying its edges and including water squares and other such things. And then those works in available spaces. So here's the school here, the schools, the canal and the foreshore here could link together with other available public realm spaces or social housing or other available land in a network of a dual-use public realm that could work in one way in wet conditions and another way in dry conditions, as is very well known strategy. At a finer grain, we also discussed with both the council and the community new ways of organising people to work together. And this was a little idea that came up in the studio called water body corporates, where just like tenants in a group of flats could work together pay fees perhaps to look after common areas such as a garden or an elevator, groups of landowners along a drainage, in this case a laneway, but it was a previous drain, into the canal system might work together to more effectively manage their stormwater and their water, their integrated water more effectively. And new infill development, which is happening in areas such as Elwood, could be incentivised to feed in a more contributory way to this organisational unit, which is somewhere between an individual house and the larger body of the council. And we looked at ways in which the substantial number of walk-up flats, or six-packs you might call them, in Elwood might be modified and might work with such a body corporate structure. And how buildings could be retrofitted to both increase new, this is the social housing, both increase new living typologies that worked with changing demographics and other issues as well as water issues, and circulation rationalised to increase the amount of pervious surfaces as an incremental sort of adaptation process. And this sort of meant, and the citizens of Elwood were very aware and conversant in all this, and they like to talk about Elwood as the Venice of the South. They're quite excited about embracing water in the everyday realm and what new entrepreneurial and life and living typologies and experiences that might give rise to. So here's that social housing and student collage of rather extreme event. So the second area is in another catchment. It's the Arden Macaulay is down here at the bottom, typically in the bottom of the catchment where all the flooding's happening, and it's part of the Moonee Ponds catchment, which spreads interestingly all the way from central Melbourne through the middle suburbs and out to the current periphery. So it involves a number of councils again, and there's a lot of people, including Melbourne Water and others, who are trying to find ways of talking across this very large area. We were interested in this as part of this ongoing swamp research. So here's Elwood. This is a map of 1864. Here's Elwood Swamp down here. Albert Park, you'd recognise. South Melbourne. Fisherman's Bend is this group here. And this is the bottom of the West Melbourne Swamp, which is at the termination of the Moonee Ponds Creek system. And the darker blues are the modified areas. This is the Arden Macaulay development, about the current development boundary and the previous mappings of the previous swamp outlines, which was previously a terminal lagoon, which overflowed into the river only in times of flood. But in the late 1890s, a canal was dug to permanently connect the fresh and the salt water, fundamentally modifying the natural ecology. We don't quite know what it looks like because there wasn't a lot of recording of conditions before these acts soon after settlement, but it might have looked something like this. And here is the first photograph we could find looking at Coot Island. So this is Fisherman's Bend over here. So this is after a lot of the vegetation's been removed, but you can see the nature of the low-lying waterlogged land, which we're currently building a large extension to Melbourne on. In the 1960s and between the 19th century and the late 20th century, it was filled with rubbish and landfill. And so Arden Macaulay today is a kind of this was an attempt at combining historical and future and current information, where we have the previous swamp outlines. The yellow shows current development areas, Arden Macaulay, E-Gate, and further south is Fisherman's Bend. All of these development areas are within land that in the 19th century was thought of as unfit to build. The pink is infrastructural projects. So we have the Melbourne Metro Tunnel coming through here with the station in Arden, and the Western Distributor, and of course CityLink is through there as well. So it's a real congested bottleneck, if you like, of infrastructure, of transport infrastructure and pipes, sewers and so on, as well as water. And as was mentioned briefly before, this was always a really significant meeting place, this swamp, for Indigenous groups who were coming from the west and the east and would meet at this place. So we wanted to try and think about how could we move forward in a way that also understood the previous chain of ponds and terminal lagoon structure. And came up, these are all student projects, came up with ideas of introducing dams at certain key points along existing roads that could gradually separate in a more controlled way the saltwater conditions and the freshwater conditions, so we can get brackish, semi-brackish and so on, and that they might then, those different water conditions would establish different ecologies and microclimates and plant communities and maybe even building communities. The dams here could regulate the flows and at times spill into each other and be thought of as a kind of a human-made infrastructure that also modified and worked with the natural systems and changing and adapting the existing industrial city over time. The levee banks were proposed to be broken and the space of water spread laterally to allow, rather than constraining the flow into a concrete channel, to give it more space. And that means that different types of public spaces might, in the zone of each of these dams, might arise and might be possible. So this is a rather hypothetical drawing of areas of kind of concentrated development and areas where the braided watercourse of the creek might be given more space and a new kind of public realm emerge, and that incorporates existing parts of public realm, but it also means that a not even approach to development. And here you can see the so-called islands of high density or hyper density, where the existing road network has these dams that regulate the flow from the freshwater condition to the salt. And this is the kind of public realm that might be floodable and able to be used in the other times. So this was all in this search of an abundant and ecologically diverse new development area that provides not only new density and strategic location to the city, which everyone wants, but also new connections to nature and open space, new ways of living in sync with natural systems, being more aware of and in tune with seasonal changes. Longer term, at maybe a 50 to 100 or 150 year scale, we might need to think about a sea level rise in different ways, and this is a map looking at a kind of 3 to 5 metre raise of level where you can see islands such as Emerald Hill in South Melbourne. And we might be able to conceive of this whole lowlands area as performing more like a half land, half water condition, and there could be areas of building and areas of non-building and areas of canals and so forth. And the need for this whole region to potentially transform in nature and play a different role at a metropolitan scale, protecting the city beyond it. So what are the alternatives? A quick estimation indicates it would take over 100 kilometres of seawalls to protect currently vulnerable settlements and infrastructure, and we know that seawalls just divert the problem to somewhere else. In an extreme case, it might be tempting to construct a barrier at the mouth of the bay if we had our 20th century Dutch hats on. But as already noted, the bay is not really at deep sea, but a shallow basin, and total evaporation from its surface has been calculated as greater than the total current freshwater input from rivers and rainfall combined. Without access to the sea, the bay may well revert to its previous grassland state, with a shallow terminal lagoon, especially under future reduced rainfall scenarios. And it's recently been hypothesised that this may have happened naturally between 1,000 and 2,000 years ago, when the mouth of the bay silted up with a natural sandbar, and this may have also contributed to Aboriginal cultural memory of its reflooding. But rather than singular big engineering projects, our research has led us in the direction of what might be called post-industrial hybrids, cumulative landscapes that accept and absorb past actions as they are modified and adapt to new conditions. A geomorphological lens sees the current state of affairs as a process, a record or a transcript of past events, and evolutions over deep time. In this sense, it's fundamentally dynamic, always in motion, and fundamentally hybrid and composite, being made up of multiple events containing elements of many different ages and origins, both natural and human-made. And a few very quick examples to finish. This is a weir that's recently been introduced in the Conda Lake system by the Gunditjmara people down near Mount Eccles to try to re-establish the swamp that was drained in the 19th century and re-establish the eel farming areas. This is McLeod Morass near Bairnsdale, where after 100 years of dumping the town's wastewater into the morass, they're now working at the wastewater treatment plant and the water management, flood management are trying to work in concert with each other to manage water and improve the nutrient levels of this highly altered landscape. And this is Winton Wetlands in what used to be Lake McCommon near Benalla, an area that was once a swamp, very significant for the local Yorta Yorta people, was then drained for agriculture. The farms were then repossessed, compulsorily acquired by the government to make a dam for irrigation, and then less than 40 years later that dam was broken and turned back into a wetland swamp, and the remnants of the dead red gums are the legacy of the dam era. And with enlightened management, this is now a sort of repaired, the next stage in this landscape's complex and contested history. So progressive repair and rehabilitation of water systems can be achieved through careful intervention, enlightened management practices and a strategic understanding of urban development, not going backwards to a static conception of nature idealised from afar, but moving forward to the next hybrid iteration, informed by the ongoing study of natural ecosystems and by nurturing a deep cultural memory of the past. Thank you very much.